The word is Mandarin, and that's spelt Mandarin. And this word is the name of the main language of China, the language which is spoken by roughly 65 to 70% of the population of China as their first language, and by most of the remainder as the official state language. And so that makes Mandarin the world's most widely spoken language today. Mandarin is not the word that's used by the Chinese to refer to their own language. The language in China is usually called, if you'll excuse my extremely bad Chinese pronunciation, Putonghua, which means common language. And as you can hear, it's completely different to the word that we use for the language in English. So that means it's an English word, right? Wrong! Mandarin comes into English from Portuguese. It's first recorded in English in the late 16th century, and it appears in Portuguese not that much earlier, in the early 16th century. It's the word that the Portuguese used to refer to the scholar officials who ran the bureaucracy of the great Chinese Empire. So the Mandarins, as we call them, were a group of bureaucrats or officials, but they were also very highly qualified scholars who were well versed in the classic Chinese texts, particularly the writings of Confucius. So they had come to prominence as the officials of the empire over a long period of time, from the years of the Song dynasty, from roughly the 9th century onwards. So the Western idea of the Mandarin is one which is reflected in the modern day English usage of the word. In the UK, when we talk about Whitehall Mandarins, we're referring to the senior ministers who sit in the ministry buildings in Whitehall alongside the UK Parliament. The term Whitehall Mandarins is a suggestion of their immense and almost rather sinister learning and power, satirised in the popular 1970s and 1980s BBC sitcom Yes Minister, which starred Nigel Hawthorne wielding a great deal of power through his cunning and his suggestions to his superiors. But that, of course, begs the question, why did English need to borrow this Portuguese word when talking about Chinese ministers? Well, the reason for that is that the Portuguese were the first European power to establish diplomatic ties and a trading relationship with the Chinese Empire. It was through the Portuguese reports of this diplomatic mission that most of Europe first came to learn about contemporary China, and particularly about its system of government and these very powerful and very learned senior officials, or mandarins. In Portugal, it's widely presumed that the word Mandarin is derived from the Portuguese verb mandar, which means to order or to send. So a mandarin would be somebody who issues orders. But this is a completely false etymology. And it's a false etymology which we should be very suspicious of, because it kind of gives all the glory to the Portuguese diplomats who went to China, and completely effaces from people's understanding of their history the role that was played by a completely different people. Which is to say that Mandarin is not a Portuguese word either. We can trace it back further to the Malay language, the Malay word menteri, which means minister, and is still used in modern Malay. So the reason why Portuguese had adopted and adapted this Malay word menteri to give us Mandarin, or in English Mandarin, was that in the period of Portuguese expansion through South and East Asia at the end of the 15th century and beginnings of the 16th century, they'd already made contact with the Malay peoples in the areas of the world that we now know as Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Indonesia, the Philippines. The Portuguese, when expanding their trade empire, had been particularly keen to take control of the very, very profitable trade in spices. They found that there were already a lot of Chinese traders based in the Malay lands, and in particular in the Sultanate of Malacca, where the Sultan had invited them to settle in the late 15th century. Malacca had been sending diplomatic missions to China for some time. So when the Portuguese conquered Malacca from the Malay Sultan in 1511 and turned their attention to the idea of trade with China, and a trade not just in those spices, but also a trade in Chinese goods such as silk and porcelain that were in demand across Europe, they drew on the existing regional knowledge of China and the expertise that the Malays had accrued in dealing with the Chinese bureaucrats, the people that they naturally called the Menteri. So this means that Mandarin, the word that we use for the world's most spoken language, the language of modern China, derives from the Malay language, right? No, wrong, again! It's a word which Malay has actually borrowed from Sanskrit, from the Sanskrit word mantri, which means counsellor or advisor, and is closely related to another Sanskrit word which has come more directly into English, which is the word mantra, which we think of as something that you chant whilst you're meditating, but actually also means advice or counsel. Sanskrit was as important in its day globally, or at least across a very large area of the globe, as Mandarin Chinese or English are today. It spread right across East Asia and Southeast Asia, and as it did so, of course, it influenced all of the languages of those regions. Thai, Malay, even Vietnamese and Chinese have a large number of words derived from Sanskrit. So Mandarin is a simple but fascinating word because it tells us a great deal about the history of Asia and of the shores of the Indian Ocean and of the Eastern Pacific in particular, and also because it tells us about the history of the interactions and movements of different people and of the trade in not only goods but equally in ideas, religions, systems of government, and so forth over a period of well over 1,000 years. So it's interesting that the word Mandarin, which connects the two most widely spoken and most globally influential languages of the early 21st century, English and Standard Chinese, also connects both of those languages with three of the most influential languages in world history from earlier periods: Portuguese, Malay, and Sanskrit, which is no longer used as a living language but is still read in the form of sacred texts. The word Mandarin is also used in a couple of other contexts, of course. Many people will be familiar with Mandarin oranges. That's a small, sweet citrus fruit. And it seems that the name Mandarin was given to them sometime in the mid-20th century, really as a kind of marketing ploy, and with reference back to China, so the idea being that these were a special kind of orange from China. And you might also have heard of a Mandarin duck, which is a small waterfowl that originates in China, but is very frequently found in places like Europe these days because they were collected by people with landed estates, because the ducks have spectacular plumage and look very decorative on ornamental ponds.